Welcome, everyone. We are here with Georgia. Today, we are going to be talking about, well, wherever the conversation takes us, but generally about motherhood, the patriarchy, and how we navigate this as mothers. So, Georgia and I were just talking about how we both just like to jump right in. And I'm putting you on the spot. How about you send us off with a thought, a commentary, maybe like a recent story that you found yourself in that intersects this like motherhood and patriarchy idea.
Okay, yes. So I was actually just thinking about this morning. I was listening to a podcast recently, actually, about patriarchy, and there's this woman, and of course I can't remember her name in this moment, but she studied sort of human development over the course of 20, 30 years. And she talked about that she noticed in boys around the age actually of 4 or 5, and in girls around puberty, so like 12, 13, that there was this sort of seemingly this force that was applied to development where they both, men and women, underwent changes. And girls tended to go from really outspoken, really strong, really kind of, she called them sort of whistleblowers, like, no, that's not working for me, this is working, to very quiet. All of a sudden they felt like they were confused about things, they didn't really know stuff. And boys at 4 or 5 went from being really attuned and really sort of emotionally aware and really open to asking for what they need to sort of like more withdrawn, more independent, more like, like, oh, I don't need that, or no, I don't want you to kiss me goodbye. And she was like, what is happening? And eventually she was like, oh, this is patriarchy. This is patriarchy infusing itself, like bringing people in, like via almost like an initiation into the patriarchal society. And so for boys, what that sort of meant was they needed to become unattached, unattuned, and more like, oh, I don't need your kisses. Oh, I don't want to cuddle. Oh, I don't even actually notice that you're feeling any kind of way. And oh, I can do it myself. And girls, and like I said, around the age of puberty became less smart, less, like demanding, less asking for what they needed. And girls sort of lost their voice, and boys sort of like, girls became I don't know, and boys became I don't care. And
Interesting.
yeah, and it was really this almost chilling for me because I have a 3-year-old son. And
Yes.
I'm like, oh my God. And then you think about, that sort of translating into women who at the age of puberty are sort of coached into this, we don't know, we can't have any needs. And she talked about an interview with one girl in particular where she said at one point she was like, oh, I could have needs or I could have relationships. And it was really powerful to be like, as women at such an early age, we're coached that we can either have needs, desires, and expectations, or we can be in relationship. And how we are coached into that by patriarchy, by a system that, at one point came into being to elevate one type of person over another. And they do that by the destruction of things that are meant to bring us together, like connection, relationship. So for boys, they eradicate feelings and care and need. And for girls, they repress voice and power and autonomy. And you think about that in the context of motherhood, and it suddenly becomes incredibly critical because as mothers, we have incredible needs and incredible desires and incredible expectations. And also as women who are separate from motherhood, right? Like as women, as our own individual people, that where we aren't just mothers, right? We are also our own individual person. And as our own individual people, we have needs as women and we have needs as mothers. And it sort of becomes this horrible dynamic where we are taught to sort of suppress our needs. So like, like don't ask for what we need, don't ask for too much, and nurture and nourish and support men and their goals in life. And men are sort of, coached to develop things like weaponizing confidence or like learned helplessness.
Yes.
Right? So it's kind of like, it's this horrible mix that comes together. And then we wonder why mothers are exhausted and sad and have PPD, and why, why men seem to be just like, well, we're fine. Like, you know, I guess that was a long intro, but that when I was thinking about this, I'm like, that's what I wanted to talk about.
Yes, yes. And actually it's interesting because I'm sure there's been many studies done on this because I read one. Again, I don't remember who the author was or who did the research itself, but it was that for boys that actually starts happening at about 8. And they related it to that naturally, not on purpose. Any of the participants didn't identify that they were doing it on purpose, but they naturally were starting to withdraw
Yeah.
physical affection. And nobody, according to the study that they were pulling everyone's results in, none of that was like, oh, well, my kid is 8 now and he's a boy, and so I'm going to stop loving on him. Like that wasn't it at all. It was like 200 people were interviewed, and it happened around this, like between 8 and 10 for boys, that either the caregivers were naturally withdrawing, like you need to be more independent, and I've even found myself in that as well. My son is 8 turning 9, and I have found myself thinking, at the end of the week, like, oh, how much physical affection have I willingly offered? I'm at this kind of intricate place because I have an 8-year-old and I have a 3-year-old turning 4. And the 3-year-old turning 4, the reason why I identify that I'm not doing it with the older is because I am doing it with the younger, right? And so it's not a conscious choice that I've made. It's not even like my 8-year-old is like, don't do it, because that's not happening at this moment. But it's an observation that I have made even in my own behavior. I'm not foreshadowing it, I'm not forethinking it, it's just happening. And I'm observing that then after a couple of days of being like, man, what is the last time I just like loved on him for a bit? And it's less than it was.
Yeah. Well, I think I think actually that's so normal in terms of culture, because it's like we live in this culture of disconnection. We
Yes.
live in this culture of, that the more disconnected we become, we've decided to label that as growing up. So you think about like
Yes.
kids, the more independent they get, the more they require, or the less they require from you, the more they ask. We're like, oh, good job, you're growing up, good for
You're
you.
growing up. Yeah.
Yes.
And also a little bit of like, because of all of the heaviness of the patriarchy, I can also connect that with, oh, thank God. Oh,
Yes.
thank God you actually don't need me anymore because I need a fucking break.
Yes. Yes.
Like,
Yes. Because you're drowning.
because you're drowning.
Yes. Because you're not getting any help, because heaven forbid you have needs.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And this there's this other level where it's like, so the idea that patriarchy is sort of elevating one voice above the others, right? And if we decide that it's white men, which it is, right? So it's like white men, then it's other men, then it's like, so white men above other men and all men above women. Then it's sort of like, well, in order to create these sort of white men who are independent and autonomous and can sort of make these cutthroat decisions. We think about CEOs and business, right?
Yes.
In order to create that sort of really masculine idea of like, we're going to do what's right for us and we're going to do what's right for our businesses or for whatever, we need to rob them of connection. We need to rob them of the humanity of what it means to be deeply connected. And so we have to praise this idea of, well, good for him for growing up, not only because we need a break, but because that means that you can now make disconnected decisions, right? Where like, you don't have to consider everybody and everybody's feelings and everybody's wants, because women don't have any, and other men will also figure it out. Yeah, it's the deeper you get, the worse it is, basically. And it's so subtle and pervasive, and it's got its fingers into everything.
Yeah.
And it's ugly.
For anybody who just like brains just went now, now let's go into like, okay, now what the fuck do we do about it? How do we continue to, you know, um, not necessarily, I mean, maybe we need to burn our bras to get fucking attention, but you know, like how do we then as, okay, I'm having this like memory. So just like everybody try to stay with me. My husband showed me this video the other day of the guy who does the voice of Optimus Prime. And it's him giving a speech at like Comic-Con or something. And he's talking about how he created the voice of Optimus Prime and how he was rehearsing with a buddy or a brother or somebody. And he was kind of practicing it in a real like authoritarian, like almost kind of angry voice. And his buddy or his brother said to him, be strong enough to be gentle. And that is what created the voice of Optimus Prime, where he's not angry. And he's actually, you know, if you look at the character of Optimus Prime, he's actually quite gentle. He's very patient. Like, no, we're not going to take action right now. No, we're not going to retaliate right now. Like, we are here to serve the humans. We're here to help them survive, right? And, you know, what's coming to me now as we've like brains exploding is that how do we, as a community of women, as a group of women, collectively but separate, how do we navigate this? Like, how do we navigate those subtleties? But also, how do we do it in a way where we don't lose ourselves in the way of then becoming the white men at the top who don't care, right? Almost like, because I think feminism can almost get into this area of like also then emasculating. We just like, then there can be this thing that happens is like, then we swing way too far this way and don't consider the fact that the men who are in these positions have been conditioned in this way. It's not like a choice necessarily that they're making. I mean, yes, daily they make choices, but like generally speaking, there's a lot of risk for them to step out of these very culturally normal, safe roles.
Yes. So I think that obviously is a really complicated question.
Totally.
And I don't know, like, you know, I part of me is like, this is just my kind of, in my own imperfect way, what I think. But I think there's a couple things. So one of them is like just being really clear on what patriarchy is and what feminism is, right? Patriarchy isn't like, you know, about like solely about just oppressing women and putting them down. Patriarchy hurts everybody. Yes. So I think that's a really important part is that, you know, like I said, with the boys, what they looked at around age 5, right, already being conditioned to withdraw into themselves, right, and pull back on that affection and then being praised for being grown up little boys, like that hurts just as much.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, you know, boys by stripping away that really like human part, right, the feeling, the relationship part, that they're suffering just as much. So I think that sort of is like really getting clear that patriarchy hurts everybody. And also that feminism isn't about hating men. It's not about blaming them, right? It's about making sure that we're all equal. And so starting with that point so that, you know, if you start with just basic sort of definitions of those things, then there's no room to hate men and there's no room to hold like, you know, like hold kind of like blaming sort of men as a whole group.
Yes.
And I think the other piece of this too is, and we're already seeing it, which is so cool, but like patriarchy really thrives on the division of gender. So patriarchy can only really exist when you file things away in either masculine or feminine, right? Emotions, sadness, relationships, cuddles, those are feminine. And if I were to say to you, you know, what's mind or reason or logic, you'd probably say masculine. And then we elevate one over the other, right? The masculine becomes elevated over the feminine. But with where the world is going, you know, patriarchy really hates people who are like gender fluid, right? Or non-binary. Patriarchy is like, what the fuck am I supposed to do with this? Right? Because now all of a sudden, where do we put those people? They don't fit, right? They don't fit. So that's already beginning to challenge patriarchy, right? And so I think what we can do is we can kind of get really clear on those definitions and really understand how patriarchy affects everybody, and about how feminism is not about hating men and not about, right? It's about kind of making sure that we're all in the same playing field. And also making, kind of this idea of like, hey, in as much as you can, moving away from gendered concepts of humanity. That the mind isn't masculine and that emotions aren't feminine. And that if we brought it all back to humans, that every human has a voice. If anyone's ever been around babies, we know that whether that baby has a penis or a vagina or a vulva, it has a voice, and it uses it. It uses it to foster connection. It's like, hey, look at me, look at me, look at me, right? It's only later, once this influence has been sort of, kind of pulled into our lives, that we sort of, that I said, that women sort of start to lose their voice. So really making sure that in as much as you can, to watch your own unconscious bias around gender, right? To talk to your boys about, hey, connection is really important. Feeling loved and cared about is really important. Physical affection doesn't make you, gay or girly. Liking softer, gentler things isn't feminine. It just is. And really encouraging that in yourself, and also, your kids if you have them. And as mothers also being like, hey, I have a voice too. That might have been conditioned out of me, but I have needs and I have a voice too. And not, and then this aspect is more complicated because it really depends on your relationships.
Yes.
But requiring of your partner to meet the needs that you have, which you can voice with the voice that you have. Right? Like kind of coming back into yourself and being like, oh, actually, my husband and I just had this conversation a few weeks ago, where I said to him, the equal balance of chores don't work for me. It's not a thing. And we talked about making sure that the relationship was equitable instead of equal. And that, he grew up in a very stereotypical family, very influenced by patriarchy. And he just was like, well, I just don't think of things like the groceries. It just doesn't occur to me. And I'm like, okay, well, how do you remember to do shit at your job? And he's like, oh, well, I have a schedule and a calendar. I'm like, cool. So you have those skills and you're capable of them. So you just need to apply them here. And it was like, oh.
Yes.
That it's not like they are incapable of learning to do what we do. They do it in their job all the time. Yeah. So it's kind of like, what can we do about it? We can get educated, and we can kind of watch how we unconsciously in our conditioned to make things masculine and feminine. And we can remember that at the end of the day, we're all the same. We all have a voice. We all have a requirement for a relationship. Those are kind of like the base primary things that we come into this world with, is a voice, right? Primary emotions, anger, sadness, disgust, surprise, and joy, I think are the 6. I missed one there. This is 6 primary emotions we're born with. And the need for connection, right? Like very early, we become attuned to our moms or our primary caregivers. And that never changes. It's just conditioned out. So really remembering that, like, hey, we can still be deeply attuned to our partners, deeply attuned to our kids. And that's okay. And that's normal. And that should happen. And if there are periods of disconnection, which are normal, how can we come back? Instead of being like, instead of boys being like, oh, I don't care that they're disconnected, right? I don't care that we're disconnected. Or girls being like, oh, it doesn't matter. Like, I'll just find somebody else, or it must have been me, or what can I do? Or I just can't speak up about this. That stuff isn't true. It's just made up. I think that was long and a little bit rambly, but did I answer your question?
It was awesome. Yes, I think
so.
so.
Like some kind of a tangent there. Like,
yeah. Because it's so, you know, when you're working one-on-one with someone, which Georgia and I are both therapists who do one-on-one work, you know, these conversations, when you can sink deeper and deeper and deeper into the why, or the humanity behind, you know, the humanity behind the need. So many of my clients have come to me and said, well, I couldn't, well, I shouldn't, well, you know, my partner will just say this. And within the therapeutic relationship, always assessing, you know, what might be this, you know, a safe thing to say, or a gentle nudge, you know, like, is, and then what? You know, and then what would happen? Just the other night, both my partner and I worked all day. We were away from the kids. He works 12-hour shifts. At 6 o'clock that day, I was like, as soon as he comes home and we have supper, I'm going upstairs. And I said to everybody at the supper table, I said, Mommy needs a half an hour. I'm going to go upstairs. I'm going to do whatever I want. The door's going to be closed. Please do not bother me. And that interaction is now normal in my house. It wasn't for a very long time, but it is normal now. And that time is respected. The time is, and I live with 3 boys. And that time is respected because I have explained the humanity behind why I need it, why it's important. We've talked about it as a family in terms of, both my partner and I are introverts. We both need alone time. And our kids are very much aware that, like, if daddy takes off for an hour on a Saturday and goes upstairs, he's having alone time. And that's not about you, you know, child. That's filling an adult need.
Yes.
And every single person on the planet has needs and deserves to have them met in whatever way they need to be met, even if it's to one person seemingly outrageous, you know, like, why would you need to go do this for an hour? Or why would you need to go do this for a weekend? Or, you know, and that's where that, like, idea of equity comes in, because I think, in my experience anyway, and in a lot of the stories I've been on the receiving end of, is, why does my partner need to go away for a weekend? And then often, you know, if we can get to the breadcrumbs of that, the female who's sitting in front of me will often say, because I couldn't imagine being away from my kids for 3 days. How can I work with a lot of people in heteronormative relationships. So sorry for anybody who doesn't identify with that in this example. There's all of these conditioned messages around what you should and shouldn't do as a good parent.
Yes.
And I'm using air quotes for those of you who can only view the audio right now. Good in air quotes.
And again, you know, I accidentally one day said to, you know, I was working with this child-free person, and she was like, oh, you know, mother's always looking down on me. And I accidentally just stumbled, and I was like, oh yes, the cult of motherhood strikes again. And then, you know, it kind of became this thing that I was like, wait a second, because again, you know, people are going to be sick of hearing this word. This is another aspect of patriarchy, right?
Yes.
If patriarchy can pit mothers against each other by defining what a good mother is,
Yes.
we'll be too busy criticizing each other to care about, like, why do we need to criticize each other? Yeah. There is nothing, I've said this so often in my work, there is nothing else on the planet like motherhood. Nothing. There is nothing else on the planet that is well defined by some random entity that we don't know, right? Some society thing that's like, this is what a good mother looks like. It looks like this and this and this and this, but also creates the most impossible standards. Like, a mom has to parent like she doesn't work, but work like she doesn't parent, right? And she needs to be the granola mom who, like, wears the apron and bakes the cookies and doesn't send her kids to school, blah, 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 but also needs to be, like, you know, bringing in income and being a member of society and blah, blah, blah. Like, we create this impossible construct for mothers and then pit them against each other when we don't meet needs. So, like, fun fact, we got a new car yesterday. We traded in our car and we bought an older, new to us car. It is a 2-seater sports car. It's a 2-seater MX-5. I have my car seat in the front seat next to me. I tied it in. I tied it in. I'm driving this car and I'm like, oh my God, I'm living my best life. Right. And I pulled up next to someone who rolled down their window and was like, you have a toddler in the front, like basically, and I won't repeat all of the things that she decided to say, but it was like, you're a horrible mom for having your kid in this sports car that clearly wasn't meant to be. And she got me in a good moment, but I was like, I'm so sorry that you feel so threatened, basically by the choices I'm making that reflect my needs. He's perfectly safe in his car seat. He meets all the BC legal driving standards. Kids don't have to sit in the back seat. As long as they're strapped into a car seat appropriately and the car seat's attached to the car, it's fine. But it was so reflective of me that we are so ingrained in this standard and will other moms do this, right? Being a good mom means this, instead of being like, wow, no one else has my brain. No one else grew up the way I did. No one else has the mindset I did. No one else has the attachment style that I do in the way that I have it. No one has the relationships I do, or the partner that I do, or the support system that I do. So how could you possibly have the same needs as other moms? And we never do that with anything else. People are like, oh, you're a mom, so you should blank, 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 and you should enjoy this, and you should like it, and you asked for it, and blah, blah, blah. No, when your friend buys a new house and you're like, God, I love my house, but the taxes are high. People are like, well, you fucking bought it. You better like those taxes, right? No one does that. Or when
you chose this.
Yes. Or when you're like, God, I have to build this fence. People are like, oh, I'll come over and help you. No one's like, well, you fucking wanted that house, build it yourself. No one does that. Your husband doesn't come home and is like, I didn't notice that we didn't have a fence. Yeah. Right? I'm clearly passionate about this, but I'm like,
yes.
No other thing in the world is as highly criticized, as highly gatekept, as highly, has the most impossible standards as motherhood. And we buy into that because we're conditioned to, because heaven forbid we have needs or a voice. Because we sacrifice those things to have relationships, which we need.
Yeah.
And so it's like, hey, if you suddenly put that lens about anything else, a job, buying a house, buying a car, where you live, literally all the other things we do as human beings, if we suddenly put the lens that we do onto buying a car, onto having parenting and being a mother, suddenly it's like, oh, well, of course that I don't want to take my car in for service. That sucks. Maybe someone else can take it in for me. Or maybe the dealership can just after this, right? If we were just like, hey, this doesn't work for me, and allowed ourselves to say, it doesn't matter that my parenting doesn't look like everyone else's, right? There are people who think that I'm absolutely insane for having a 2-seater car and living in a 2-bedroom place in Vancouver with almost no space.
Right.
Right? Our kid doesn't have a room. He doesn't have a room. He doesn't have a bed. He doesn't have a playroom. He has 3 toys. It works for us. We love it. I'm getting my needs met and he's very happy. He has a ton of parks to play in. We go for bike rides. He's okay. My husband does most of the parenting, most of it. He does almost all the cleaning, all the cooking, and he works more than me. Because the job that I have and the way parenting affects me takes more out of me than it does him. So why would I be equal in that when it takes more from me than it does from him? Right? But I need to talk about that. And I need to feel safe to talk about that. But it starts with believing that I deserve to, which is something that patriarchy robs from us. It's this belief that we don't deserve to have our needs met, or we shouldn't have needs in the first place, or our needs should match those of other mothers. When it's like, no, none of that is true. That's all made up. That's all systematic. Let's get another rant. I feel obviously really passionate about this.
The passion is amazing because I think what you just said deconstructs, I think, what the typical, and when I say typical, I mean by the majority, the belief that's held by the majority.
Yes.
Would be buying into that conditioning, not knowing that they can't. It's not even that they can't use their voice. It's that belief. It's the belief that they can't or that they shouldn't.
Oh,
Right?
yeah.
Like even in session the other day, I was working with someone and we were dismantling a bit of this, like what an equitable relationship looks like. And her metaphor was that like she was wearing this like cardboard cape and that nobody else could wear the cardboard cape, and the cape just like weighs on her, and it's, you know, it's cardboard, it's not like this, right? She's like literally wearing a box. And there was this moment where she realized that even in this session where it's just me and her, we have a long-standing, what I would deem a pretty safe therapeutic relationship. About 5 minutes later, she realized, she was like, I censored that answer. That wasn't even what I wanted to say. And I said, okay, let's get into that. Like, I'm curious about where that censorship is coming from. And if it is the therapeutic relationship, then of course we need to talk about it. But you know, if it's something outside of that, if it's this held belief around censorship and around saying that first thing that came to your mind, and you censored it, you talked yourself out of it. We need to talk about that, because if it's happening here, I can guarantee you it's happening out there, and it's happening in your relationship. And, you know, potentially this is where we ended up in the conversation, is like, potentially that's why the cardboard cardigan is there in the first place.
Yes. And so, you know, what you just said reminded me of this excerpt I read in this book, and I can't remember exactly anymore what it was said, but this woman was interviewing this girl who was like 22, and she said something like, oh, like, does it bother you that you feel like you can't say what you mean or something? And she was like, oh no, like, it doesn't really matter to me that I'm giving this up. And then the woman was like, you know, that's really sad. And then the girl was like, actually, and then the interview was like, that's the word I learned to listen for, is the word actually. And the girl was like, actually, I never tell people how I feel. And that way, if they criticize me, the joke's on them, because they're criticizing something that isn't real and they'll never know who I am. And it's just sort of like this deep, again, reflection of like, oh, we're conditioned again. Like, we cannot be honest about what we need, because what might that mean? What are the consequences of
What are the consequences of that is like, is key. I can't tell you how many times someone has said to me, well, if I do this, it will likely end in divorce.
Yes.
And you know, I'm, you know, holding a curious and brave space. I'm kind of like, and then what? Tell me what would be the hardest part about that? Like, because if it's not equitable now, what are the consequences of you commanding that time, having the audacity to say it out loud? And I mean audacity in the best possible sense.
I love the word audacity. I have the audacity all the time.
All the time. Like I have been called a bulldozer. Like I can be a little bit emotionally like, no, I got needs and they're going to be met. Like there is no two ways about that. We can discuss your needs 100%, but like, here's mine.
Yes.
And, you know, like you, I require a lot of contemplative time. I grew up as an only child in a single parent household. My house was quiet.
Right.
I live with 3 boys and a dog now. Like, it is a lot for my stimulation, and I'm neurodiverse, and 2 other of my family members are. And so it's like, we all have needs, and we all have different sensory needs.
Yes.
And within the construct, you know, of everything that has been said today around the patriarchy is subtle, and it's hard, and it's crushing. Coming back to those definitions that you said, I think are really important around, you know, the patriarchy hurts everyone. And feminism is about equality for everyone, regardless of how they identify, or that gender fluidity, you know, or if you identify as male, female, on any other word that you would like to identify with, is that research shows us that if you have been conditioned a certain way, even if you don't identify with that gender now, these messages and conditions are going to live inside of you. And it is really, really important to be planted in your own humanity, in your own why, in your own values, because how Georgia does it is different from how Kayla does it, which is how different than the majority of you listening are doing it. That doesn't make it wrong. That doesn't make it bad. That doesn't make it anything. It just makes it what it is. And if you can sit firm, or even just with one butt cheek on the chair, in your authenticity and having the audacity to command that your needs be met, and also having the grace for when your gendered male partner commands for their time, that you're also gentle and compassionate in those interactions, because we get resentful and angry and bitter, not because they're asking for what they need, but because we're not.
And that, I think, is really the message, that I always try to also get people to take away is, hey, we shouldn't do everything we're capable of. I really want moms, anybody literally who's listening to this, we are absolutely not meant to do everything we're capable of. Just because you can sit with your baby for 12 hours while your husband goes out and gets his needs met doesn't mean you should.
Mm-hmm.
And that if you notice resentful feelings, exactly like you said, towards your partner, you need to ask yourself, hey, what am I not getting? Because that resentment is the message, right? Anger is, I always say, anger is my best friend. Anger is always the one. She's going to come through for me to let me know when something's not okay. So if you're angry, which is in resentment, irritability, annoyance are all aspects of anger. If you're feeling any of that, like, whoa, what's she trying to tell me? Right? Like, and then to believe that just because we can doesn't mean we should, and that we deserve, at least the same amount of like time and downtime and hobby time that our partners are getting, if not more. Because then there's this whole other aspect of like, well, men get energy from testosterone, which they make all day, while women are sort of rely on adrenal energy, and we need sleep to get that, and women are often the ones not sleeping. So I won't get into all of that, but like, there's a whole aspect here where like, it's not about fairness, and it's not about what other people are doing. It's just about you and what you need. And that, kids need two things. They need attention, and they need, they need autonomy, they need power, right? Attention and power. And if kids feel like you are interested in them, like you love them, and that you treat them like they have their own set of ideas and beliefs, which they do, that's what being a good mom is. I'm kind of like, at the end of the day, if your kids feel loved and they feel like you're interested in them, great. No matter what else you've done. Like, like, no matter what that looks like for you, it's kind of like, yeah, being a good mom is having kids who feel loved, interested in. So things like sleep training or potty training, or, like whether you fucking homemade, I don't think I've literally ever homemade anything for my kid in 3 years. Like, I don't cook, so that's a thing. But it's like, I'm a great mom.
Yes.
And to allow yourself to feel that, like, no part of me thinks I'm a bad mom. I'm like, I am slaying at this. Like, and it's just like, and I don't think, I don't really play. Like, those are not the things. I don't spend all day with him. I don't love all our moments together. And you get to define what that means for you. I feel let yourself feel that, because allowing yourself to feel like a great mom doesn't mean you're going to fuck up.
Oof. It actually pretty much means that it guarantees that you are.
Yeah, it's sort of like people. Yeah. I hate when people are like, well, if I let myself feel like I'm good at this, it means I'll stop trying. And it's like, no, that's, that's wrong. So yeah, like just letting yourself feel good about whatever choices that you're making.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a really great note to conclusion and wrap up with, because right now, as you're listening, when we stop this recording, I want you to take a moment wherever you are. If you're listening in your car, at your desk, in the chaos of making supper, I want you to take a moment right now and take a deep breath and say to yourself, in whatever version you need to say it, I am enough. If it's more helpful, most of my clients like to say you, because it feels like it's a message coming from someone else instead of an I belief. Just take a moment to sit in that right now, today, in this moment, even if your kids are screaming and you've got your headphones in to ignore them, that you are doing enough. You are doing enough. And you're doing your fucking best. Like, that's just, you are doing your best right now in this moment. Thank you, Georgia, so much.
Yeah. Oh my God, I'm also going to tuck that in there. Also, you have needs and a voice, and you get to
yes.
on top of being enough, because you're enough inherently, and that's such an incredibly important message. And we get to ask for what we want.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I love to talk about stuff that I deeply care about, and I can talk about it forever. So I'm so deeply appreciative of you, and I'm so glad that you exist and that we met, and that I get to do this with you. This was cool. Thank you.
This was really cool. We should probably plan a part 2, for like fall-ish. Yeah.
Yeah, I would do part like 100 with you.
Thank you so much for hanging out with us today on the Chill Like a Mother podcast. If you had an aha moment or found yourself saying, oh yeah, me too, maybe share this podcast with somebody who might appreciate it, a friend, maybe in your mom group or on Facebook. Episodes come out every Sunday to help you with those Sunday scaries. And subscribe so that you never miss an episode and you can carry me, Kayla, around in your back pocket. If you liked this episode, please leave us a rating or a review. I'd love to hear from you. And if you want to look at it behind the scenes and get exclusive ways to be more chill as a mom, follow me on Instagram at chill.likeamother. All of the mentionables are linked in the show notes, and always, this is not a replacement for professional advice, though we are professionals. We're not your professional, though we do encourage you to seek whatever professional supports you may need in your life. And in case you haven't heard it today, you deserve the time and the money that it might take for you to take care of yourself in whatever way you need taken care of. Have a relatively chill day and catch you in the next episode.